Our laws are not static, any more than our society or human nature are static. Their roots, grounded in history and watered by wisdom, are constantly putting out fresh branches and leaves for the comfort of all people.
Grandchildren of David Maxwell Fyfe. We have spent time over the past decade telling the story of David's journey from prosecuting the Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials to becoming an artisan of the European Convention on Human Rights.
We have told that story in two ways. We performed Sue Cassin's acclaimed song cycle Dreams of Peace and Freedom, a reflection to prompt people to think about the roots of modern human rights.
And we explore the same story and its present impact through social media storytelling. This podcast is an addition to our social media storytelling library. We think that it's a great time for people to think and talk about human rights.
75 years ago, on July 15th, 1951, the BBC celebrated the 200th edition of their London Forum broadcast.
Inspired by Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, the series had previously been called the Freedom Forum. This particular discussion, featuring David and Eleanor Roosevelt, took place a year after the ECHR was signed and was called Could We Do More to Secure Human Rights?
This is Edgar Lustgarten introducing today's London Forum, which happens to be the 200th of the series. The London Forum has in fact been running weekly without a break ever since the summer of 1947. So our subject today is, could we do more to secure human rights?
We were told by the General Assembly that we had to put into the first covenant the economic and social and cultural rights, and we are finding that's extremely difficult.
The sum of human misery, in my view, is largely contributed to by people who ignore the dignity of the human spirit and human rights.
We wondered what a conversation tackling that question would sound like today, and mailed around 100 people, many of whom we've encountered in our work, to ask them to take part. These are the people who said yes, for which we are very grateful.
The discussion has revealed all sorts of views, some of which we may not agree with, but it is wonderful to hear people talking about human rights.
We hope that this will be a first edition, opening the conversation with more voices to follow.
You're listening to
Lord David Alton of Liverpool, Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights.
My own personal interest in human rights comes out of my own family's experiences. My mother's first language wasn't English, it was Irish. She was a migrant from the west of Ireland where her parents had died very young. They were poor hill farmers and they were scattered, 7 children, to the winds.
Bashak Chula, Professor of International Law at Oxford University and Head of Research at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights.
So I think everyone comes to human rights through personal experience, and I've also come to human rights through personal experience. But I think my sort of first personal experience with human rights was in the school, in the playground, and in the classrooms, when I realized that not all students were treated equally by the teachers.
Ian Cook, capitalist, socialist.
It's not something I think about a huge amount. It's not something I'm an activist in, and it's something that I have to say that the way the human rights industry has gone, I sometimes stand back a bit and think, why are we going here?
John Edward, Head of Operations at the Scottish Council on Global Affairs.
I mean, obviously, for most of human history, the individual rights of humans haven't been understood or recognized. People wouldn't ever see it as something that was important to them. But I think as we move away, or at least in parts of the West, we move away from a kind of unquestioning sense of religious belief where you let other people take the decisions and set the rules for you, then understanding what are fundamental rights the world over it seems to me to be increasingly important.
Bryce Evans, Chair in Modern World History at Liverpool Hope University.
As a modern historian, one has to be interested and invested in human rights, and that as a principle, when you look at the periods of warfare in the modern period and the peace thereafter, has to be a sort of underpinning feature of our world system. So I think any professional historian, as I am, has to be keenly interested in human rights because it effectively shapes the world in which we live.
Jasper Gold, Civil and Public Law Barrister and editor of the UK Human Rights blog.
One of the ways that human rights comes up in my practice is that I represent the families of deceased persons who've lost their life while in the care or the responsibility of the state. And so I see really human rights as a tool for state accountability to protect the individual from the temptation of state overreach.
Baroness Brenda Hale of Richmond, former judge and president of the UK Supreme Court.
My specific interest in human rights is that I was for many years a senior judge, firstly in England and Wales, and then in the United Kingdom generally. And that coincided with the implementation of the Human Rights Act 1998. So I played quite a considerable part in the training of the judiciary before the implementation of that act, and then, of course, in deciding quite a lot of rather important cases about the act. So I could scarcely fail to be interested in it.
Helen Kuttner, volunteer for Holocaust Education Trust.
My dad came to this country as a refugee, aged 9. He and his parents and his sister and one of his uncles fled Nazi Germany, and they were fortunate to be able to do so. It wasn't easy. My grandfather spent 3 months in a concentration camp before that happened. My dad's grandparents and another uncle were murdered by the Nazis and other extended family. So I suppose I have grown up with that sense of the potential of danger.
Charlie Macmillan, Director of the Human Rights Consortium, Scotland.
Personally as well, I'm a gay man, and human rights have been absolutely central to my life over the last 42 years or so. I think it's really fundamentally important that we keep relating human rights to our own experiences so that we can better use them in terms of society and organisations.
Jennifer Nadel, co-founder of Compassion in Politics.
I am the daughter of a child refugee who arrived in the United Kingdom on the Kindertransport. And of course, many child refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria were not so lucky, and many adults were not so lucky. So I exist because of the kindness of strangers, and human rights are essential to my view of the world. The fact that we are all born equal. We all like to talk about the fact that we're born equal, but how do we ensure that we are all treated equally? And for me, human rights is the answer to that question.
The Very Reverend Mark Oakley, Dean of Southwark Cathedral.
My interest comes really, I think, from a personal experience of being gay and living and working in the church. And I've known what it's like to be discriminated against and have to argue, as it were, for my dignity. I think that's where it began. And then, of course, as you grow up, or hopefully as you grow up, you realise what it might be like to be other people in similar situations, and indeed a lot worse situations.
Professor Cato Regan, inaugural director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights and a former judge of the South African Constitutional Court.
So I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and I think we all come to human rights generally from our own personal experience. There is something that has made us realize that human rights really matter in our background, and that can be all sorts of things. But for me, it was growing up in apartheid South Africa, where, for my first years of my childhood, I accepted the world as it was, as we all do. But increasingly in my teens, and I began to realize that there was something really wrong in the way in which the world worked.
Deborah Singer, human rights activist at René Cassin.
So I think my interest in human rights probably comes from the fact that my parents were Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany and came to England as children. And most recently, I've been working with René Cassin, the Jewish Voice of Human Rights, which is a charity which particularly focuses on marginalised groups.
James Stewart, actor and constitutional activist.
My interest in human rights is as being a human and wanting to hold on to my rights. What my parents did instill in me was these big L liberal ideals of equality, freedom of the press, justice for all. Everybody gets a fair hearing in front of a judge with a jury, and human rights.
Michelle Waite, senior lecturer in law at Liverpool John Moores University.
I've practiced as a solicitor since 2007, mainly in the field of housing law, but more recently, the last few years, I've been really working on helping people to access a particular type of civil legal aid, which is there as a human rights safety net. Human rights kind of come up and need to be used and need to be accessed in people's everyday lives.
What can we learn from the pioneers of modern human rights after the Second World War?
So why they thought it was so important was that the world, and Europe in particular, had emerged from a period of totalitarian government in much of Europe. And of course, as Winston Churchill put it, an iron curtain had descended over Europe, which meant that totalitarian government was going to persist in Eastern Europe. So they thought it very important to band together the original members of the Council of Europe, to band together to make a statement of those basic fundamental human rights which those states agreed, legally bindingly in international law, to protect.
Clear-sighted commitment and the belief that there is a thing called human dignity and that it needs protecting because they had seen what happens when it isn't. So clear-sighted commitment, a belief in human dignity, a belief that it is universal, and also that you can believe in hope. That, Martin Luther King Jr. never once said, "I have a nightmare." He had a dream, and human rights are built in a way upon a dream. Of course they are. But it's a very important dream to have.
if somebody had set this as a sort of business school problem, how can you get so many different countries to agree to adopt a declaration on human rights in 1948, it would have seemed pretty unlikely. You have to remember that was a dramatic year in many ways. We saw the partition of India. We saw the introduction of apartheid in South Africa. This was a very difficult post-war year. And the pioneers of the Universal Declaration in particular persisted through these challenges to produce something which was adopted by the vast majority of members.
Well, I'm really conscious as I speak to you that I am absolutely standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of Eleanor Roosevelt and David Maxwell Fyfe and many others. They lived through those horrors of the Second World War that I've just mentioned. They had experienced things that I hope never to have to experience and live through in terms of generational trauma, in terms of death and destruction. And I think what they taught us was that vision of something better and different is really fundamentally important.
They were visionary people. They really were. They saw that tolerance and openness, and they saw that could lead to a better society for people rather than the authoritarian system that had been widely spread.
Whatever way you view the sort of course of history, it was incredibly important post 45 to have that punctuation mark, to have those pioneers post World War II, to say, you know, what has happened, what has passed, especially with regards to the Holocaust, was so egregious that it is now time that we had a universally agreed global set of defining principles.
One of the things that I find incredibly valuable in the post-Second World War thinking about human rights is the combined embracing of the economic and social and cultural rights and civil and political rights all in one place. And this is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has also achieved. So not to compartmentalize rights and not to think about only a certain set of rights as the most important ones, but actually to think about rights holistically.
The thing about human rights is that they're absolute. They're absolute and they pertain to each of us as individuals. They're not relative. And so I'm particularly concerned that we have forgotten or are willing to take risks with what the pioneers of human rights understood were really, really essential and non-negotiable.
Well, I think we need to stick to maintain a conviction of what is morally right, to not give up on that, no matter how difficult, how challenging, how impossible the goals feel. We have to keep our focus on that.
I think be bold. I mean, the easiest thing, I guess, to do after the war, even with forward-thinking lawyers like Maxwell Fyfe, would have been to say, well, let's just rebuild. You know, let's get ourselves back on track. Let's get the economy going. Let's get people back to work and this kind of stuff. And hope that in some ways the prosperity that might come from that would rein in the more revolting tendencies that the war had exposed. But clearly that didn't work in 1918. Clearly that didn't work in 1870. Clearly that didn't work in 1815. And back you go. So I think the boldness of saying, no, actually, it doesn't have to be like this. And there are some basic truths.
I've been inspired by their innovation, their way of being able to think completely differently, to come up with this idea that the individual has rights in relation to the state, and that the state has a duty to protect its citizens. I think I'm also inspired by the fact that the Jewish lawyers involved were drawing on such awful experiences and to help others beyond the Jewish community.
What I can learn from those pioneers, your ancestor and others around him, in that time was their measured, their measuredness. They brought to bear on the biggest problems of the world a fierce intelligence, which was then mediated through calm words and clear direction.
We learned about justice during that period, and Sir David Maxwell Fyfe and many others, whom I referred to in a parliamentary debate I initiated in the House last year to mark the 75th anniversary of the European Convention on Human Rights. We should take on those who say we should lead that convention.
If you look at the thinking behind the convention and the political motivations behind setting out these lists of rights of the individual against the state, it's very clear, this is not a left-wing or a right-wing project. It's on a different political axis. It is about the protection of individual rights against totalitarian and overreaching states. Which has its proponents and its detractors on all sides of the political spectrum.
I think one of the biggest lessons is that human rights are an integral aspect of peace and us all being to live alongside each other. And at the moment, the world feels like it's quite a febrile place. And there are people who, for their own ends, are trying to undermine, these hard-won rights.
Human rights are a way of describing the universal character of humanity. At present, many people don't relate to this. Fear, division, and lack of knowledge get in the way. Why do you think that is?
Well, we're living in an anxious time for many reasons. There is a climate crisis, there's economic issues, there's warfare. There are lots of people living in poor mental health. Things that people thought were stable have started to dismantle. AI is starting to threaten jobs. I mean, there is general anxiety around in big measure.
I think two sources are mostly to blame, one of which has traditionally been the media, because certain sections of the legacy media in particular fairly quickly started referring to the hated Human Rights Act. The second has been certain politicians in now, I regret to say, at least 2 and possibly 3 political parties who blame the European Human Rights Convention and the Human Rights Act for the problems that we suffer in relation to migration.
I think that we're encouraged by manipulation to blame our problems on a group of people. So as we begin to see them as a problem, which is almost an inanimate object, we lose sight of them as human beings.
A big part of this is about the way that human rights are kind of thrust into the spotlight in a lot of the kind of mainstream media, and it's kind of these links are made that don't really tell anyone about what rights are involved and what they're about and how they're applied and what they might mean in your own life.
It is true that one of the reasons why people don't always value human rights is that there is a very often amongst human beings an instinctive way of dividing the world into the us's and the thems. And I think, our understanding of human psychology and our understanding of history tells us that is one of the ways in which human beings respond to the world and explain the world about them is by using us and thems.
I think this hatred and division is taught, and not just that, it's inculcated, it's incubated, it is formed very carefully by forces around us and above us.
It was a Danish theologian and philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, who said that life must be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. In other words, history is a great teacher. And I think we're starting to forget some of those lessons from the 20th century. And I think the idea of the common good and universal values have been superseded by autonomy and choice, the idea that my individual rights are more important than collective human rights.
My experience as a teacher of human rights law is that when you give people enough time to reflect on the ideas that underpin human rights, they in vast majorities agree with them. So they agree with that, there should be standards of treatment of human beings.
That idea of the greater good in some ways seems to be disappearing a little bit. We're becoming much more partial. Society's becoming much more partial, perhaps even going back to being a bit tribal.
From the historical perspective, the concept of universalism, the language of rights, is a relatively new thing. We're talking about, of course, the post-war era, but also the post-World War I era, really the interwar era, is where this language of rights comes into its own. And so, although I very much believe in the principles of human rights, I think when you look at violations thereof these days, I think I can only explain it in the sense that, in historical terms, it's very recent to have that sort of universally codified and agreed set of world governing principles.
That explanatory path, to me, comes back to a lack of exposure. And it's very easy to support the human rights of people who we know and understand, and much more difficult to get behind the importance of rights when it might seem more alien to our own lives.
These things only matter when their loss or their absence is greater than the other concerns in your daily life, or is the source of your greater concerns. And people may think they don't come across these things, but think of every time you've been irritated by questions at a border, with your passport, or you had to queue for hours to do that kind of stuff, or you've been stopped by a policeman in a check, which you think is a little unfair, you weren't speeding, or you were trying to get somewhere important, or, a lot of people consider themselves to be terribly law-abiding until suddenly they feel that the law is acting against them.
I think there could be many reasons for that. I think one of the biggest is actually that people have been promised the experience of human rights and the betterment of their life and their life experiences over decades, and that has failed to materialize for so many people.
We also focus very much on our freedom to do whatever we want in, our advanced, ultra neoliberal agenda, where individualism really is prized above the collective and the common good. We have this idea that we shouldn't be tied down, that we should be free to do everything, but we forget about the other side of freedom, which is the freedom from oppression, the freedom from torture, the freedom from extreme poverty and instability. Those freedoms matter just as much as our freedom to act. And in fact, for large swathes of the population, there is no freedom unless freedom from is enshrined, as well as the freedom to.
People just don't see themselves as rights holders, that they have human rights themselves and that they can claim their human rights. And yet we actually have like a premium package of rights. We've got a really good deal in this country. And we often, at René we often say it is like Eleanor Roosevelt's, what she said at the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when she talked about human rights being in small places close to home.
Our understanding of human rights adapts to the condition of the world at any time. How would you describe the evolution of human rights over the past 75 years?
Wow. I think it's been a tumultuous 75 years in terms of that experience of human rights. I think that much has been achieved. I think there has been real progress. I think the European Convention of Human Rights, the Council of Europe, the European Court are all absolutely fantastic developments that have done so much in the promotion of human rights, and that fundamental legislative underpinning for people in terms of their human rights. So a job well done there, but I think that constant vigilance is then required to make sure that the rollback in human rights does not increase. And we're seeing that, I have to say, sadly, more and more at the moment.
We must remember what happens when you do nothing. And then we must remember what brave men and women did in the post-war period. I've mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some of those 30 articles that were adumbrated at that time are honored in their breach all over the world to this day. But that Universal Declaration still stands, and though many are denied those rights, we must fight for them.
Development over time is the encroachment onto or development into, depending on your point of view, social and economic rights. So, for example, the right to housing, the right to education, these things which are still largely not justiciable in the European Convention. You know, the court isn't going to say this is how you have to arrange your national housing supply.
There's been all this sort of social progress after the post-war settlement from the winning of the peace that enables us now to kind of have these conversations about human rights in everyday life and what they can do for us and how they can tackle injustices on that level.
I think there's been a shift away from states establishing rights to individuals owning rights, perhaps. So, you know, we are far from being done in terms of states accepting, you know, the core principles of the convention or whatever it might be, even within Europe itself. But there is even in the more fervent aspects of politics on the fringes, which we're all experiencing these days, you don't get many people going, human rights is a pile of nonsense. You know, generally they don't, because they know deep down that even they have human rights that they wouldn't want to infringe.
And this is where I think about the duty, particularly seeing through the media, seeing all the legal cases that come up that have been given prominence. It's the international side of things, but the duty side of it seems to have been lost a bit.
Even if you look in the last sort of 10, 15 years, going back to the Iraq War, going back to Afghanistan and the current conflicts we see today, especially in the Middle East, I think sadly we're seeing the more frequent erosion of a lot of those principles than we did in perhaps the first 50 years or so of those principles being agreed.
The idea that never again would we see the atrocities that happened in the Second World War gave birth to what we now call human rights. But unfortunately, since their birth, we have seen atrocities across the world, not at the level that we saw in the Second World War, but we've seen pockets of absolutely terrible violations and abuses of human rights.
I think in general, and when the world economy is unstable or people are experiencing economic difficulties, very quickly the end result is scapegoating. It seems to be a common repetitive pattern.
The evolution of it has been the enshittification of it, one might say, losing our focus. The Second World War, and especially what happened with the Shoah, the extermination of the Jews throughout Europe, that focused people. And people said, we've got to put in place processes, policies, procedures which enshrine human rights.
What we do need to remember, because it's easy to be depressed about where we are in human rights. Actually, there have been in many parts of the world some very significant gains achieved over the last 75 years. So the world has recognized human rights in many places. On the other hand, the last 20 years in particular has seen a growing backlash or decay in the way in which democracy and human rights is treated around the world. So it's not been linear. And I think progress on human rights is often not linear.
I think one of the benefits of the human rights framework is the fact that it does evolve with time. Obviously, the sort of social mores now are very different from just after the Second World War and the Holocaust. So, for example, the writers of the European Convention on Human Rights, David Maxwell Fyfe, etc., would never have dreamed that that it could be used to enable same-sex marriage.
This evolution has to become even speedier. I think, the international human rights systems have been slowly evolving, but I think that we probably will need a lot more speedy thinking and evolution. I don't know, evolution or revolution in the age of artificial intelligence systems, incredible speed, really dominating quite vast majorities of human life.
There is a view, one of the criticisms of the European Court of Human Rights is that it has treated the convention as a living instrument. Now, this is not a radical idea in constitutional interpretation. It is a general principle of constitutional interpretation, certainly in this country, and I think in other countries too, that constitutional instruments have to be given a broad and purposive construction, which will necessarily move with the times.
So I think that we're on a very different, we're standing in a different landscape now. I think it's a lot more precarious. And I think it's almost as if we need to start again, actually. But I'm worried about that the people often in power and the people who are rising in power are not the people to begin that conversation again. They want to avoid it.
Can you offer some immediate practical steps to help people recognize their own human rights, respect the rights of others, and understand that human rights are in fact universal?
Yes, I can. And I think education is part of this. For 20 years, I had the privilege of holding a chair at Liverpool John Moores University, where I set up a foundation for citizenship. And part of that foundation's work, we ran a series of public lectures where rarely less than 800 or 900 people would come to those lectures, but we would also present awards to young people for the part that they were playing in some small way, but things begin with small deeds, in some way by being active citizens.
What I would like to see is a great deal more education about the Constitution, the machinery of government, the relationship between Parliament, government, and the courts, and the place which fundamental rights plays in that.
Teaching about human rights to widen our scope. But it can't be just an academic exercise. It really has to be conversation rather than confrontation. The problem is, on our streets, what we're seeing is masses of confrontation, and you get lines of people screaming at each other, and then they're a mirror image of each other.
There's always people are always talking about their rights, or people are talking about the rights of others, particularly. We seem to forget that if there's a right, someone has got the duty to provide that right. And that does seem to get lost. So it's about what can we actually do. Well, human rights are basically about allowing people to be themselves and be safe and secure.
And I think we need creative communication that helps people respond in a way that just a few statistics and a few well-meaning history lessons won't always achieve. So I would say, if you want to think about practical steps, start commissioning the artists, the writers. We need imaginative, creative, engaging influencers and artists to begin that process.
That the way in which we treat people in our ordinary lives, whether it's in our homes, our workplaces, our schools, this is a place where you can start fostering an understanding of what it means to be respectful of human rights, to be respectful of your own human rights as well as of everybody else's. And it's not that easy, I think, to have kind of grandiose ways of making people understand. People have to understand the detail of it in their own lives, what it means in their own lives, in their own institutions, in their own places.
If people think about themselves and the people they love, their family members, their friends, and think about, just on a really fundamental level, how you would like to be treated and what, the things that you would like for the people you love. If that was the starting point, I think that helps us to have more empathy.
We need to help other people to understand the lives and motivations of people. And I think maybe the most relevant example at the moment where a lot of attention is focused is in the issue of migration. So in telling people's stories, I think it's important to drill down to the personal.
I was thinking about this recently in terms of football and the incredible diversity of the countries playing in the World Cup and the experience of those individuals. Never mind the experience that a lot of those individuals are feeling simply going to watch the football and their human rights may be being questioned. And I suppose one way would be to consider how the laws and actions of other countries would affect you if you were them. Increasingly in this globalized world, we know a lot more people from a lot more countries.
I think far too often in terms of the human rights discussion, far too often in terms of the human rights story, if you like, we defer to law, we defer to academia. Actually, this is about what difference human rights can make for individuals in their everyday lives.
Part of the problem with how we talk about human rights is that it feels as if they are somewhere else and it doesn't apply to our normal everyday lives. But in fact, human rights are about how we all live. It's about our dignity. It's about respect. It's about how we're spoken to. It's about equity. It's about justice. So I think we have to make human rights really granular and relevant. All of us as humans have a really strong innate sense of justice and fairness, of what's right and what's wrong. But we often forget that that's what human rights is about. It's about justice, it's about fairness, it's about equality. So how can we bring that down to how we all live? And when we think about people we love and what we want for them, it's often much easier to make human rights feel real.
Through education, but particularly through drama. And obviously I know about your singing, so that fits in with this, I think. So I wrote a film called Sunrise Not Sunset, and it's a 12-minute film, and it tells the story of a couple who were being sent to different care homes, an elderly couple, and they used the Human Rights Act to be able to stay together.
Not just having human rights as moral principles, but also the value of having them as legal institutional safeguards. Just think about, very practical examples of, how people are treated in care homes, which is a very burning problem, in particular in the United Kingdom, and anywhere else, but also in this country at the moment.
But I always find human rights very simple in aspiration and terribly complicated in practice. But I think something that we could all remember in an era where information is being multiplied beyond all control, and it's very hard to find reliable sources of information sometimes, is that we still have, for example, Wikipedia, where you can go and read about the history of human rights.
Look at the conventions online, look at the work of the courts. Again, a lot of this stuff is sort of readily available at the click of a button. I suppose it's just getting people to access that information. So I guess on a daily basis, apart from sort of living as a good human being, it would be to sort of just have a little Google around just on your phone about what is this notion of human rights? How does it apply to you? How is it formulated? And how does it work on a legal basis?
What would be your principal objectives for a programme to educate future generations in human rights?
I love this. You know, if each of us could really understand the dignity of being human, then it would be much easier for us to defend these rights and treat others as respect. So I think that learning about human rights, and I think it's essential that we learn this in the classroom, begins with the dignity of all humans.
Obviously, it appears in my faith as, do to others what you would have them do to you. But it appears in every spiritual path and many philosophical paths. We always fail it, but it's there in the words. And so that is definitely what should be front and center of it, the golden rule.
Well, one of the objectives would be to develop people's empathy and to educate people about the abuse of human rights and what it looks like, whether that's in a state like Nazi Germany, or whether it's bad practice in the workplace, whether it's bullying in the playground, is to help people see what we're really talking about.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood against the Nazis. He was a rare figure in Germany when too many collaborated and too many went along with the fascism and the Nazism of the day. Bonhoeffer eventually was executed by the Nazis, but that great Protestant theologian said, not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. It was put in a different way by a great British parliamentarian who was Irish by background, and that was Edmund Burke. And I can paraphrase him by saying that all that is required for evil is for good people, men and women, to do nothing. So not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act, and all of us are required to do something. So in our own small ways, we can make a difference.
And I think it's almost the elephant in the room in liberal society is the impact of empire. So I think it's really important to go back to that history with all its unpleasantness and cruelty, understand the consequences of empire.
Illuminating human rights and educating people on human rights should be intelligible to all. It shouldn't be something that is, it should be properly historically contextualized. That'll be my main concern. We've got to understand why human rights or the language of rights emerges. We have to put it back in that context, but it shouldn't be something that is sort of legal and impenetrable. So I think for me, the most important thing as a historian is always context.
Most other countries have a written constitution, and so they feel it essential to educate their citizenry and residents in that constitution. We have never felt that necessary, but I feel that it is. And that's where I'd like to start, in schools, with a lovely children's book illustrating what human rights and the essentials of the Constitution are all about.
Absolutely focus on what Eleanor Roosevelt encapsulated in that famous quote she gave about human rights mattering to individuals in every day of their lives, in small places, close to home. Human rights need to have relevance for people. They need to resonate with their life experiences.
Relatable is good. Things should be relatable. But the second thing about human rights is that it's as ideas, as law, it says that we're part of a human family. So we're not just part of our school and our community and our countries or whatever jurisdictions, but there's something a little bit larger, because we're talking about human rights, not just the rights of the citizen, for example. And I think this means that education, a global understanding of society, is not just one's own country, but actually how things work globally is also incredibly important.
My objective in terms of education around human rights would always be to try to remind people that human rights are not natural rights. They are not a natural, immutable truth about the nature of humans that simply emerges from the fact of our existence, even though that's often how they're sold and how they're discussed. They are politically situated and politically constructed and politically fought for. And that means that there are people who are fighting for them and people who are fighting against them.
Education about the principles of human rights and the limits of what we can actually do. So framework and scope and application is one thing that these defining people need to really understand and talk about, and then look at how they're delivered and education about how they can be delivered.
I think it should be about enabling critical thinking, assessment, understanding about what human rights can and should mean. And I think also recognizing that at times the ways in which we've spoken about human rights or sought to pursue human rights has not been perfect. This is no human project is perfect. Human projects are often messy and difficult. So a critical, thoughtful engagement with the moral and political questions.
Key objective is for everybody to know that they're a rights holder. And it's a slightly clunky term, rights holder. It'd be quite good to come up with a different term that is more that is clearer, really.
And there are some brilliant organisations like the British Institute for Human Rights who, that's their kind of, reason for being is to really sort of try to kind of get the message out there about the rights we all have under the Human Rights Act, and to provide examples of how they can, and how they can and do translate into making, really positive changes in people's everyday lives.
Get people to chart their ordinary life, the life of their family, or their aspirant life if they're students, and this is what I've done, this is what I'm going, this is what I expect from school, university, work, whatever, and this is where I hope I end up, and then and break that down into all the points of inflection where these things are not taken for granted.
Could we do more to secure human rights? What is the single most important thing that could be done to ensure human rights are secured?
Yes, we can do more to secure human rights, and it takes the willpower of the big boys, I'm afraid. It takes, unfortunately, despite those principles of global cooperation and universalism, there's still the constancy of might makes right.
Across the world, there are so many issues that cry out for attention. But my preference, first and foremost, is to look in your own back garden first. And I think it's it's not difficult, but it's a choice to make your human rights campaigning something that looks abroad and about other people's violations, and not to pay attention to your own.
We've got the Human Rights Act at UK level. We could do so much more if those other rights were incorporated at Scots law level. So I think that's very much part of it. I think also it's about an education programme, an awareness raising programme on a profound level for duty bearers, because I have found in my experience that duty bearers don't understand their human rights responsibilities.
Yeah, education. lifelong learning. And I think we could do a lot better in terms of the way that certainly that the legal aid provision for this is administered, particularly through exceptional case funding, because that is ultimately meant to be the human rights safety net.
There has to be a deeper commitment at the societal level about all types of human rights for them to be secured. And when we say that, we also have to remember once again that there are many ranges of human rights. Human rights is not just one thing. So when we talk about human rights, we talk about how we structure our police forces, how we structure our hospitals, how we think about education, how we think about healthcare. So in all of these areas, for human rights to have some sort of influence and mileage, there has to be a background support, a general societal level.
If we could establish a well-defined system with clear boundaries, I think that would go a long way towards stopping confrontation, or not stopping, reducing confrontation.
Fundamentally, it's to have legislation globally, European, UK, to recognise people's humanity and give them rights. And that's what has happened in the past. And yet these things are under threat because of the way these issues are discussed, manipulated.
The single most important thing that can be done to ensure they are secured, I think, is by making sure that the law is being created and upheld by honest, transparent, and worthy debate.
But at the heart of this must be our willingness to stand up for powerless people, for voiceless people, and to tackle the root causes. Never give up on those things. And, if you'd said to me as a young man when I got involved in politics as a teenager, I had been deeply affected by the assassinations of Martin Luther King and by Robert Kennedy, by troops having to go into Northern Ireland, by apartheid in South Africa. My first speech in my student union was about about the need to take part in demonstrations to end apartheid. We can do small things, small deeds, because they change us as well by doing it.
We could hardly do less at the moment, unfortunately. It seems to be so on the back burner. What could we do more? We could do more podcasts. We could do more song cycles. We could do more live performances. We could make going to the theatre free.
I think stress the human rather than the rights, if you see what I mean. There's a lot of political invective which gets in the way because people say, rights, they've been taken too far, or they've been used in the wrong way. I mean, just look at the discussion about the ECHR and migration and these sorts of things in Britain. Total misrepresentation of both the principle and indeed the reality of how many times the United Kingdom ever lost a case in Strasbourg or on appeal or whatever. But actually, I think given the parallel obsession at the moment about things like AI and the new workplace and stuff, stress the human bit.
Obviously, there are what I might consider to be sort of second-tier things we could do, which is have good legislation, have institutional enforcement of human rights. These are all important. But unless human rights are understood and embraced by ordinary people in their ordinary lives, the prospect of securing human rights, I think, remains a slim one.
Education would be the most important way of securing human rights, and also using the human rights framework. So if people don't know about it, don't understand it, think it's just for other people, they're not going to use it. And if they're not educated to see that actually it's for them, then it's not going to have the sense of importance.
But I think the main thing to recognise is that all of us are the same, irrespective of what we have or don't have, irrespective of what education we may or may not have, what status we may not or may not have, what ethnic origin, what gender, what sexual orientation. We are all the same and we are all equally worthy, and we must all have the same rights.
The most important thing that we could do to ensure that human rights are secured is to stop knocking the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act.